Africa is a massive continent. In fact, it's not only the second largest continent on the planet, but also the second most populous. Today, the continent stands at an estimated population of 1.3 billion people and is projected to double to 2.6 billion people by 2050. The continent has a wealth of natural resources, ranging from minerals and precious metals to oil and timber, mostly a result of its sheer size, which accounts for about 20% of the Earth's land area. On a global scale, it also has the third largest share of agricultural land use, standing at 24%, after Asia's 34% and the Americas' 25%. It also has about 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, making the continent the most untapped in terms of farming. Despite this, the continent is often known for its rampaging poverty and its inability to feed itself. According to the African Development Bank, the continent imports about $50 billion worth of food every single year, and this is projected to double by 2050 as its population increases. The reason for this paradox of a continent blessed with unmatched natural resources, yet unable to feed itself, is one that demands understanding why Africa is in this position. To begin, the continent has an agricultural system that is underdeveloped and unmodernized, with a majority of its farmers engaging in traditional forms of farming. It also imports, grows, and consumes foods that are not native to the continent, while simultaneously growing and exporting fruits and vegetables that provide little to no nutritional value to Africa. But even more importantly, Africa simply does not have as much water as other continents, with it only having 9% of the world's water resources. As a result, the continent is simply unable to farm on the same scale and consistency as other parts of the world. Some 6,000 years ago, this was not an issue, but times change. As with all things, understanding the past is critical to understanding the present. Roughly 10,000 years ago, the world started shifting from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to an agricultural one. As a result, both animals and plants started getting domesticated around land areas with a reliable source of fresh water. The most well-known of these are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now commonly referred to as the Fertile Crescent. But specifically in Africa, agriculture started almost simultaneously at two different sites about 6,000 years ago. The most well-known is the Nile River, and the other, less known, is the Niger River. Because of the predictability of both of these rivers, the people that settled around it had a reliable water resource they could use to farm crops. At the Nile, edible grasses or cereals such as Emma and einkorn wheat were grown. But both of these wheat types are not native to Africa, and instead arrived to the continent from the Fertile Crescent. Unlike the crops grown at the Nile, the crops grown at the Niger River were native to Africa. These were African rice, yams, pearl millet, and fonio. At the time, the crops grown around both the Nile and Niger rivers were able to sustain their respective populations. But now, in the 21st century, with a much larger population, things are different. These crops are simply no longer able to provide sustainable yields for a population projected to reach 2.6 billion people by 2050. You see, all across the world, the most produced and consumed foods are cereal. In fact, they account for nearly 50% of the world's supply of food energy, making them a staple crop. Without cereal grains like maize, rice, wheat, barley, sorghum, millet, oats, and so on, the world will starve and collapse. They are high in calories and protein, and importantly, grow quickly to maintain a stable and constant supply to the world. But in Africa, the top three grains consumed, namely maize, rice, and wheat, are not native species, and so are unable to be grown locally in large quantities to support the continent's growing population. In fact, Africa as a whole produces a small amount of these staple crops and instead imports a majority of it. For instance, despite maize being the primary crop and food source in Africa, the continent imports a third of what it consumes in order to meet local demand. This is even higher for rice and wheat. The continent imports over 50% of both for consumption, and their demand only keeps increasing due to the continent's growing economy, increasing urbanization, and rising household incomes, which has shifted the continent's diet to non-native cereal grains. The most consumed foods in Africa are made from non-native crops. These crops, namely maize, rice, and wheat, can be found in almost every single household meal, except these crops are from elsewhere. Maize originates from the Americas, more specifically southern Mexico. Wheat originates from what is now the Middle East. And rice, while having two species domesticated in the world, namely African and Asian rice, the most consumed species of rice in Africa are Asian rice cultivars, with African rice cultivars making up only 20% of the rice grown on the continent. The reason for this, despite African rice being better suited for the environment in Africa and being more drought and pest resistant, and just generally being able to withstand a variety of fluctuations in soil quality and climatic conditions, is because African rice shatters more than Asian rice when fully mature. Because of this shattering, which disperses the edible rice seeds, the yield of African rice pales in comparison to Asian rice. As a result of this undesirable seed dispersal, African countries prefer to grow Asian rice, but due to the fact that Asian rice is not native, it requires more attention, more water, and often requires more inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. As a result, African countries resort to importing the bulk of their rice from Asia, where the Asian rice variety is successfully grown cheaply in large quantities. The same applies to wheat. A huge chunk, nearly 50% of Africa's wheat imports, comes from Russia and Ukraine, and the remaining comes from Asia and the Americas. This is why the conflict in Ukraine has been projected to cause a food crisis in Africa. Maize, on the other hand, is widely grown and is the most consumed crop on the continent. While not native to the continent, its ease to grow, as well as its promotion and subsidization by African governments since the 1950s, has made it a staple crop, with the continent producing 75 million tons of it and importing only 21 million tons for its yearly demand. But maize, along with rice and wheat, are all crops that require a lot of water to grow. For a continent with only 9% of the world's water resource, the over-reliance and consumption of non-native crops that require a substantial amount of water to grow is not ideal. Water is a critical natural resource. In fact, everything we do revolves around it. It's vital to our body and health, it's needed in industrial processes, and most importantly, it's needed to grow the variety of plants around us, including those we eat. As such, its role in agriculture cannot be understated. In the case of Africa, water is becoming even more critical as its population increases. This growing population will increasingly need more water for daily activities ranging from consumption and hygiene to agriculture. With only 9% of the Earth's water resource, the continent is bound to face water scarcity in the future as more and more of its water is used to farm crops that need it to grow, such as maize, rice, and wheat. Currently, growing these crops is mostly rain-fed instead of through irrigation as done in most parts of the world. This is because the continent's agricultural infrastructure is simply not developed enough, and only about 6% of its total farmlands are irrigated, compared to the 21% in just China and 17% in the United States. Farmers also prefer traditional methods of farming, so a vast majority of the continent's farmlands are cultivated using manual labor as opposed to the more modern and mechanized processes found in America, Europe, and Asia. This combination of traditional farming and reliance on rainfall leads to lower yields and also demands more manpower. This is not an ideal situation in the long term as the continent faces climate change. With climate change, Africa's reliance on rain-fed farming will be put to the test as rainfall becomes more sporadic and unpredictable. This could be circumvented by irrigating more of its farmlands, but this will only put further stress on its already small water resource. What the continent can and should do is pivot from the consumption of non-native crops to native crops. Africa, as of right now, produces and exports around $16 billion worth of fruits and vegetables, and only imports about $6 billion of it. Putting aside fruits and vegetables, it overwhelmingly imports more food than it exports. Out of the $50 billion it spends on importing food, nearly $29 billion of it is spent on cereals like maize, rice, and wheat. The fruits and vegetables it exports, such as cocoa, coffee, and tea, have no nutritional value to the continent, but a majority of its farmers prefer to plant these crops. For instance, Ghana and Ivory Coast cultivate large stretches of land for cocoa. Kenya and Tanzania do the same for tobacco, coffee, and tea. Similar instances can be found across most African countries, where instead of producing crops that hold significant and direct nutritional value to its populations, land, labor, and water are instead used to grow crops that are then exported out of the continent. In addition to this, Africa's native crops such as sorghum, fonio, yam, and African rice are becoming increasingly less consumed as its economies grow and its populations become more urbanized. However, these crops are better suited for cultivation in Africa since they require less water and are more resistant to diseases and fluctuations in climate and soil quality. The reason for their decreasing consumption is simply due to a lack of local and government support and an over-promotion of non-native crops. For instance, fonio has comparable nutritional value to maize, rice, and wheat, but only 700,000 tons of it is produced a year. Sorghum fares better and is produced in higher quantities at 20 million tons a year. African countries can pivot to promoting and producing more fonio and sorghum for consumption. This will ease the reliance on imports. In addition, producing more sorghum and fonio will lead to a direct development of better seed varieties and promote agricultural innovation, such as the fonio husking machine, which was invented by a Senegalese engineer to aid in husking fonio, which was previously both difficult and labor-intensive. There has also been attempts to develop seed varieties of wheat and rice that would do better in Africa by the International Rice Research Institute, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, and the Africa Rice Center. The Africa Rice Center has developed a new cultivar of rice called the New Rice for Africa. This rice cultivar is a crossbreed between African and Asian rice and is generally better suited to be grown on the continent. It is both pest and drought resistant, contains more protein than either African or Asian rice, and importantly does not shatter, meaning there's a higher yield when harvested. While these developments are indeed a great thing for the continent and will curb its reliance on food imports in the future, there needs to be a greater push by African governments to produce and consume more native crops. The continent's farmers also need to be encouraged to experiment and innovate in ways that increases food security and independence. Unless this occurs, the continent will be in for a world of hurt should its ability to import food be hindered by external events it has no control over, such as the conflict in Ukraine. Better management of its water resources also need to be brought into focus. With only 9% of the world's water resource, investments in water capturing systems and efficient water usage needs to be a priority as its population grows. If not, Africa's inability to feed itself will only become more apparent and disrupt any attempts by the countries within it to create a better life for their citizens.